This video is brought to you by Straight Goods News, Canada's alternative online news source. Visit straightgoods.ca.
Thursday, June 14th, and we're in Ottawa with Ian McKay and Jamie Swift at the launch of their new book, Warrior Nation. I guess I'll start with Jamie because I understand that Jamie recruited Ian for this project.
It's an appropriate metaphor given the nature of the project. You could also use the verb press gang, which would also be militarist, and the word press gang would relate to the War of 1812, which was ostensibly triggered by the British press ganging American sailors into their navy. So what the book is about is a conflict over memory and Canadian identity, the current government's attempt to reimagine and rebrand, as the title suggests, Canada as a country that's been all about war all the time. So this year, 2012, the Harper government is investing $28 million in commemorative events around the War of 1812, which strikes one as odd in an era of austerity, that this is seen as a top government priority. At the same time, this government is cut back dramatically on Library and Archives Canada so that historians, both professional and amateur, will have a lot more trouble telling Canadian stories. So on the one hand, they're retailing a certain version of the War of 1812, and on the other hand, and Ian can talk to the importance of archives in helping historians to get at the nitty-gritty of history, the Harper government is cutting that back. So the book goes from the 19th century up to the present day and looks at Canada's often ambivalent relationship with issues of peace and war.
What got you going with the project, Jamie?
In 2006, during the war between Israel and the Hezbollah in South Lebanon, a Canadian major, Major Peta S. von Krudner, was working as a UN peace observer in South Lebanon at a long-established base, and that bunker was deliberately targeted, and the major and his 3 UN allies, colleagues, were killed by the Israelis. And the Prime Minister Harper, who'd been elected a few months previously, his only response was to scratch his head and wonder aloud why this UN peacekeeper was in a war zone in the first place, which struck me as odd because this was what his assignment was, this is what his job was, is to watch and observe the situation there. And I watched as the major's cortege came to the armory in Kingston and his widow got out, and it struck me that there might be a story here, a story of the death of peacekeeping as a Canadian avocation or a Canadian enterprise, something that many Canadians hold dear. And of course 2006 was the start of Canada's folly in Kandahar.
But Ian was saying to me that although many of us, especially on the left, might like to see the Harper's focus on Canada as a military nation as a total aberration, and a departure from the peacekeeping ethos and era that lived in the past, that it's not that simple.
I think one of the things that I have found most troubling is the way that this government is recovering old imperial ideas that go right back to the 19th century. So our book dwells to a considerable extent on Canada's role in building the British Empire and very violently inflicting itself in Africa, throughout the world as part of the great imperial project. And what I find most disquieting about this present government is its zeal to recover this British imperial legacy. To the point that in the new citizenship guide, John Buchan, Lord Tweedsmuir, who was our Governor General from 35 to 40, is hailed as our primary intellectual on multiculturalism and what it means to be Canadian. So I mean, it's a little weird to have a British Lord instructing Canadians on what it means to be Canadian in retrospect. But it's even more troubling when you look at John Buchan, who was a concentration camp administrator, a major race theorist, and then right through the period of his governor generalship was counseling Canadians to beware of Negroid and Slavic influences in culture and in politics. This is someone they're resurrecting as a Canadian hero. And that's just one small piece of this really, I would call, extreme makeover of the country. An extreme right-wing makeover that is not going to leave anything in Canadian history unscathed. It's a major attempt to reprogram the country that will affect every one of us.
Okay. Does the book document the people involved in this makeover, the writers or theorists or propagandists?
For sure. Yes.
Was that the biggest surprise to you in doing the research and writing the book, this makeover, or the comprehensiveness of it?
Yes. Yes. How the decline of peacekeeping actually fits into a much bigger pattern of deliberate militarization of Canadian culture. And the scope and the depth of this is breathtaking. We're up against not a government but a regime that really says that we can select who you should admire and coerce and force certain new understandings of Canada upon you. Very, very dangerous.
Wow. Who are the authors of this new thinking?
Well, I mean, there's a group of historians who've been chafing at more nuanced versions of Canadian history, militarist historians like Jack Granatstein and David Burkeson, who the world of journalism often goes to for quotes whenever a matter of military importance comes up. And these are two historians that have questioned very fundamentally Canada's role as a peacekeeping power. What the book tries to do is to point out the ambivalence of Canada as a peacekeeping power. We have a chapter on Lester Pearson and James Endicott, and the conflict between these two men who grew up as Methodists in the early part of the century, and how they had a falling out over peace and war, and how Pearson was trying to use peacekeeping as a sort of a tightrope to walk between empires. So Pearson most famously proposed the first big UN peacekeeping force in 1956 during the Suez Crisis, which marked a watershed, symbolic and probably actual real watershed, between the end of the British Empire. It was a total disaster for Britain, the Suez Crisis, and the rise of an American imperium. And Pearson tried to navigate that.
What do you hope readers are going to take away from this book? What do you hope will be the outcome of the book being out there?
I would say two things. One is to be very, very alarmed and worried about the scope and depth of this right-wing extremist approach to Canadian history. This is not a game. It's not just empty symbols they're playing with. These are actually core ideas about what it means to be Canadian, and they're really been thought out and imposed from the top and in a very, very intelligent and well-crafted way. The second thing I would say is there are substantial grounds for optimism that Canadians do have a legacy of peace activism, of thinking of themselves as a peaceful country. There's still a substantial number of Canadians who will resist this program. So this is by no means a counsel of despair that we're offering. It's really a cry of warning and saying, you have in your history alternative ways of thinking about peace and war. The Canadians realistically have evolved over the years. They can be recovered. You can still think intelligently and with sophistication about peace and war in Canada. And there's a sizable proportion of the Canadian population that still wants to do that. They just have to be energized and wake up to the peril around them that this new regime is